So I'm Dale Portland. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Research and the Dean of the Graduate School at Montana Tech, and it's my pleasure to welcome you at Montana State, here at Montana Tech, and also at the Bureau of Billings to what's going to be a great and very interesting talk on energy the next 50 years. But before I do that, I want to bring to your attention some upcoming talks we have. In particular, George, our speaker today, George Crabtree, will be back in this room tomorrow morning at 8, where he will talk about a new paradigm for battery research. And that also will be broadcast both to UM and to MSU. And as part of the thermodynamics course in the material science PhD program, courtesy of its professor, Professor Downey. Next week, we have 2 seminars in our series. They're less scientific and technical than most of them. On September 30th, in the Natural Resources Building, John Britton, who's a lawyer from the University of the District of Columbia, will talk about recent developments in equal access to higher education, diversity, and college admissions. And on Thursday, in the Chemistry and Biology Building, John Rausch will talk about strategies for the next generation, lessons from a life in environmental leadership. So this is a conservation type talk, and he has been involved in the Wilderness Society and all sorts of other organizations like that, with his PhD, I think, in Chaucerian English literature. But meanwhile, coming back to today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. George Crabtree. George has more jobs than I do, currently. So George got his bachelor's degree in engineering science at Northwestern University. Then he went to the University of Washington, Seattle, and got a master's degree in condensed matter physics, before coming to the University of Illinois, Chicago, and getting a PhD in condensed matter physics. George has been with the Argonne National Laboratory for a long time, like 25 years?
Or even more.
Or even more, possibly. Mostly in the material science division. And over the past 8 or 10 years, he's been tapped by the Department of Energy to lead or co-lead numerous studies that then guide the Department of Energy's priorities in energy research of a whole variety of types. Most of the ones that George gets involved in have at least a little to do with materials. So it could be hydrogen energy, it could be superconductivity, solar energy, materials under extreme environments, and those kinds of things. He's currently a faculty member, professor in the departments of physics, electrical, and mechanical engineering. I think that's 3 departments at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Plus, he's the director of the Joint Center for Energy Storage Research, which is an energy frontier center.
No, it's an energy innovation hub.
It's an energy innovation hub, which is located at Argonne National Laboratory. And I suspect he still maintains his senior scientist position in the material science division at Argonne National Laboratory. So please join me in welcoming George Crabtree to talk about energy the next 50 years.
What a pleasure to be here. What a great introduction. It's nice to be reminded of what you've done. Thank you, Bev. And I want to nod in Bev's direction as well. We called her Bev when she was at Argonne. I don't know what you guys.
That's what we call here too.
Okay, all right, good. And what a pleasure to renew an old sort of friendship and relationship. We knew each other, I don't know, a decade ago, I'm going to say approximately. And thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to be here. So I want to talk about the next 50 years, but actually in talking with Bev just before this seminar, we decided it might be fun for me, I don't know about you, if I spent a minute or two and just told you a little bit about my path through life. And you may have noticed that I have 3 degrees, which is kind of unusual for someone with a PhD in physics. Very often you skip the master's. But my father was an engineer. He taught me a lot around the house and around the car. We would change the oil and do lots of other things on the car. Those were the days when you could do that. And so it was very natural that I went into engineering. Northwestern University was very close to my home in the suburbs of Chicago. And I really enjoyed my time there. I thought it was wonderful. But I realized I wanted to know a little bit more about how things worked than is typical for engineers to know. And so I got fascinated by condensed matter physics, went off to the University of Washington because I was trying to get as far away from Chicago as I could, and that was one of the places that was pretty far away. Had a wonder, and that was just because I wanted to experience new lifestyles and cultures. Had a wonderful time there, and for a variety of reasons, I never thought I would leave Seattle, and I intended to get my PhD there. Came back to Chicago, and that was I don't know how many years ago, maybe 40. And got a job at Argonne National Lab, and I was actually a lab technician. So at that time, I was not a PhD student. And after 6 months as a lab technician, I realized that I really had to go back and get my PhD. So I did it at night. So I was a lab technician during the day, 40 hours a week. At night, I would go to, as we call it, UIC, University of Illinois at Chicago. It's about a 25-mile drive from the lab, and take classes. It took me 5 years to get my PhD. I was lucky enough to, my thesis project was related to what I was doing as a lab technician, so I kind of was able to do, get a double whammy out of that. But a great experience, and I spent most of my career at Argonne doing condensed matter science, as it happens. Superconductivity, the biggest event in superconductivity, at least in the last half of the 20th century, was the discovery that copper oxides superconduct at over 100 degrees Kelvin. The previous record was 20 degrees Kelvin, and this was a major transformation. So that happened when I was at Argonne, and we picked up that problem right away, and I really enjoyed working on it for 25 years. And then got interested in energy, as Bev says, and found that it was just as fascinating as condensed matter physics. So that brings us to the title of my talk, The Next 50 Years. I'm going to present a perspective that you usually don't hear. It's really, in a sense, radical. And the radicalness is right here in the title, 50 Years. People are reluctant to talk about 25 years in the energy game because you can't predict that far ahead. And nobody wants to make a mistake, so everyone confines themselves to things that they think they can predict. It turns out, and I'll show you, it takes 50 years to change the energy system. And what people do typically now is they say, I'd like to know what's going to happen in the next 25 years, so I'll start with the present, and I'll extrapolate. And I think the price of this will go up or down. This technology is going to get better. Solar is going to get cheaper. Last 5 years, we say, well, fracking is going to get more common. And you try to predict in that way. And what you get at the end of 25 years is today's world slightly modified, usually by economics. But I want to propose something different. I want to say, look 50 years in the future. Ask yourself, what kind of a world do you want in 50 years? And I'll show you some arguments in the first few slides that say it's energy that's going to determine that world, whether you can get there or not. So ask what kind of a world you want in 50 years and start doing the R&D now in areas that will be needed to realize your vision. So don't extrapolate. Be transformational. So this is a message you don't hear very often. Well, I just told you the whole talk. This is in collaboration with my colleagues at UIC, Elizabeth Koch and Thomas Alon. Here are my messages, and I think I'll go through them. Whoops, didn't mean to do that. I will go through them as they come up. So I like to be conversational, and feel free to interrupt me at any moment. Oh, there's a published version of this talk. We wrote it up and published it. So it's in this journal, Futures, and you can find it. I think
it's a smart board.
It's a smart board.
So
okay.
it does
Don't touch the board. So you can find this in your library if you want to look at the fine books. So here's the first thought, that energy is part of everything we do. And I've listed here transportation, agriculture, buildings, and cities. Cities are just concentrations concentrations of energy. Medical diagnostics, everybody's taken an MRI almost, or if you haven't, you will. And communication, this is even old-fashioned. So this guy's talking on his cell phone, but what we do now is text. But that's energy. So everything you see here is energy morphed into a different form. And the lesson is that energy determines both your this is, well, let's say not you, but the society, the aspirations of society. Everything takes energy. If we have enough energy, we'd like to do this. And it also determines the limitations of society. If you don't have enough energy, I'm sorry, you can't do that. And there's a good lesson for this. Let me see what's next here. Yeah, okay. Another story. Go back to 2008. There was a financial meltdown, the Great Recession. Suddenly, energy was, number one, oil was cheap. So oil went from $140 a barrel before the Great Recession to $40 a barrel, you may remember this, just after things crashed, and it's gradually come back up to about 100. So energy was cheap in the form of oil, but nobody had any money. And the fact that energy was around didn't matter. You couldn't access it. So it's really energy that counts, and that theme will come through the talk as it unfolds. So here's the reason for 50 years. This is a chart, sorry, oh my goodness. This is a chart now, published by Stephen Chu, the ex-Secretary of Energy until about a year ago, and Arun Majumdar, who was the director of RPE at about the same time. In 2012, in Nature, this shows for the U.S. What percentage of our energy came from all the different sources, going back to 1850. You see wood, that's reasonable, and you see that coal came up starting at the end of the 19th century and was dominant through about the middle of the 20th century. Then we started driving cars, and for transportation we needed a lot of oil. So oil really grew, and after World War II especially, the interstate highway system and so on. Natural gas came on the scene. Here's nuclear. It grew and kind of stagnated because the public got worried. And you hear a lot about renewables, wind and solar. Well, you can almost see them on this graph. That's this little thing right at the top. But they're growing fast, maybe 30 or 40% a year. So what's the lesson from this? All of these transitions take about 50 years to happen. So if you think you're going to change the energy environment any quicker, it's probably wrong. The reason is there's so much inertia. While you buy, let's say, electricity generation equipment, it has a lifetime of 40 years or 50 years. You have to retire it. And so this thing goes slowly. But there's a good side and a bad side to that. You can't change it fast, you wish you could. But on the good side, you have time to plan for the transition. So you don't have to just take what comes down the pike. You can actually be strategic and plan what you get. So I've already mentioned this at the beginning. Conventional approach of predicting the future is that you start with today's technologies and say what's going to happen economically. And what you get is an extrapolation. One thing that you assume in these predictions is that there will be no breakthroughs. And the reason everyone makes that assumption is, again, they don't want to be wrong. We don't have the breakthrough now, and I can't count on one in 5 years, so how can I put it into my projection? But you can take the fracking revolution as an example of what happens when you ignore breakthroughs. So go back certainly 10 years and maybe even 5 years. Fracking was nothing, and nobody thought it would ever be anything, but it is. Very big surprise. And so all those 25-year predictions are more or less out the window. So I would like to take the opposite point of view. We know what kind of breakthroughs we would like to have. It may, your favorite may be solar or something else. Let's go after them. And if we go after them, we can sort of guess what the positive impacts will be. So that's this proactive approach. So as I was saying earlier, define the global society we want in 50 years, and I'm planning to include not only the United States and the developed countries, but all the countries. developing and not yet developing. Identify the strategic energy outcomes that we need to enable the society we envision, and then target the R&D that you need to get there. Very different point of view. So now comes the thing where we can all have our own opinions. I've taken my opinion and put them on the board here. It's the prerogative of the speaker, but feel free to disagree. And I think the things that I've chosen, what would we like to see in 50 years, might be things that everyone would more or less like, but there's no guarantee of that. So the first one that I chose, I have 6 of them. First one I chose is rapid growth of the developing countries. And that's because that's what they want. China is a great example of a country. I'm not sure I would call it developing anymore. It's pretty developed, not as far as many countries in the West, but it's pretty developed. That's an example of what can happen in 20 years. And there are many other countries that would like to achieve the same kinds of development. So they should. It'll be a much better place if everybody lives on something closer to the same lifestyle than we have now. So I think that's an important point. You'd like to also have, can I make this work? Oops. Okay, they're all here, but so the animation's gone, but that's fine. So here's the second one, steady growth of the developed countries. So again, if you go back to 2008, the Great Recession, we didn't have any growth for a while and very slow growth for a longer while. Times were tough. So in the developed countries, it's really not the level of the economy, but the growth in the economy that makes things happen. So we need to have some growth in the developed economy. So that's important in a sense for us. Third point, aggressive pursuit of discovery, science, and innovation. Why? Because that's what makes things better. You don't want to get stuck with the same, let's call it, developed society for the next 50 years. You want it to develop further and change. Well, you've got to make some discoveries, you've got to have innovations, and that takes resources, so you kind of have to plan for that. And that's in fact the fourth point. Once you discover things and innovate things, you want to get them out there, so deployment of innovative technology, that takes money and energy as well. So you want this. Lively communication here, the fifth one, trade and exchange of people and ideas across national and regional boundaries, and I'm thinking of China, Asia, Latin America, Europe, North America. You want all of those things to communicate well, so you want everybody on the same boat. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And this is, again, important for a healthy global society. And the last one, similar to this one, globalization of opportunity and participation in everything we do at the frontier. So there's a billion people in China. Some of them are really smart, and you'd like to have them contributing to the well-being of the entire world, just as we do here. You don't want anyone cut out. So it's summed up by this: a vibrant, interactive, inclusive, and rapidly advancing global society. Those are my choices. That's what we want. Well then, what do you need to get there? So what are the energy outcomes to achieve this? And I found 3 of them. Here's the first one. I'll show you the other 2. The first one is energy security. You have to be pretty sure that you can get the energy you want. So what does that mean? Well, it has to be adequate, so enough to do the things you want to do. It has to be affordable, so you can actually, you have enough resources to buy it. It has to be sustainable, can't run out in 10 years or 50 years. You want to be able to have it for the long term. And a very important one that people often forget, it has to be predictable. So if you look at the price of oil, we already talked about this. Up until 2002, anyone know what the price of oil was in 2002? And there's no reason why you shouldn't know this. But it's interesting, it was $28 a barrel. And then it went up like a skyrocket. By 2007 or 2008, it was 140. Wow, you can't plan for that. If it's suddenly going up at that rate, and you're thinking, what am I going to do in 10 years? Well, I don't know what the price of oil will be. How can I make any plans? 2008, the Great Recession, drops down to 40. $80 a barrel and then slowly goes back up. It's around 100 now. With that kind of fluctuation, it's really hard to make long-term plans. And so what that forces everyone to do is to make short-term plans. I won't plan for the long-term future. I'll plan for what I think I know, and that's short-term. So that's really a negative. So you want it to be predictable. Second point, and let's see if I can make this happen.
Okay, you did.
Oh, it did.
You
I just have to wait.
You did it twice, though, so.
I can't go backwards. Okay, here it is. Stable climate. Why? Well, the world has only a certain amount of resources. They have to devote most of those resources to the fundamentals. So food, shelter, a minimum level of public health, right? And we're seeing some problems there in Africa right now. And that takes money. And then what's left over, you can devote to moving ahead. And what's left over, the discretionary resources are usually not very big, right? There's always a squeeze on it. So imagine that the climate is not stable. And that some of the predictions for 50 years from now come true. And who knows how many will. It's going to cost money to deal with them. And one very reasonable thesis is that it's cheaper to prevent those climate changes than it is to pay for accommodating them. Nobody knows if that's correct or not, but it certainly looks like that might be the case. So I put down a stable climate as something which will allow us to enable in 50 years the kind of global society that we want. We could imagine a path there. If the climate is not stable, it's pretty hard to imagine. And it's going to take resources to deal with that instability. Here's the third one, economic development and growth. And I get questioned on this a lot. People say, well, the world has finite resources. Here it is. That's the world. And we're going to grow, 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 grow. Aren't we going to bump into a limit eventually? And I think we will. I don't understand those dynamics well enough to say anything intelligent about it. But I can say that for the moment, it looks like what experience says, you need an increasing rate of growth. You need a rate of growth in order to achieve, the next step, to go to the next level. So you need that. So let's plug that into our system. So let's see what's next. Okay, there it is. So here I've now outlined the energy breakthroughs that we need to achieve this society. Those top three energy outcomes, how do we achieve those? Here are some breakthroughs that we need. And I've got 6 of them here. So I've divided them into categories. Stuff that's already happening, so things that are on the road. Whoops, I knew I could do that. And I put in that category wind and solar electricity. Really good, and I'll show you how that's growing. So there's some challenges, but it looks like it could happen. Stuff that's on the road, but not yet sustainable. So 2 things there. Replace coal and gas electricity with safe, high-performance nuclear. This is always, let's say, a controversial subject, but I'll tell you some things that I'm thinking about it. And the second one, replace coal and gas with safe, abundant, and inexpensive shale gas, another very controversial subject. The new feature that I may add, you may have already thought of this or heard of it, is that with the right kind of science and technology, you can make them acceptable. And if they were acceptable, that would add a lot to the energy landscape. And then some things that are not on the road. These are way out there things. Everybody talks about what do you do with their carbon emissions. Well, I say let's mineralize them to rocks. So carbonate rocks really can hold an awful lot of carbon. If you could find a way to take the exhaust of smoke of power plants, carbon emissions, turn it into calcium carbonate, let it sit on the ground, you've solved that problem in a way that lets you burn some fossil fuels without affecting climate. That's one. Develop electricity storage for cars and the grid. I'll talk about this tomorrow, so I won't say much today. And make chemical fuel a sustainable energy carrier. Real tough one. We burn our fossil fuels, they turn into water and carbon dioxide, and that's it. Number one, they're gone. The water's okay, but the carbon dioxide can do some harm. Can you recycle that stuff and bring it back and make more fuel? That's the idea. So let's start with wind and solar electricity. This is what we'd like to do. This is what we are doing. So the wind is the blue, the solar is the red, going back to about 1980 when there wasn't much of either one. And you see that that wind started earlier and was pretty flat for a while and really is taking off lately. Both of these are growing, wind and solar, around 30% per year, depends which years you look at. But they're growing really fast. They make up about 4% of our electricity supply now. If I were giving this talk 2 years ago, I would have said 2%. That's how fast they're growing. So it's still a tiny percentage, but it's really growing fast. Well, what could we aspire to here? Let's say that you had 15% growth per year. Let's just say that. The actual growth rate is higher, so maybe you could achieve that. Then you would get to 40% wind and solar electricity by 2030, if you were able to maintain those growth rates. So it looks like you could do pretty well. You may know that there are lots of renewable portfolio standards, as they're called. States that have passed legislation that say we're going to have 20% wind and solar electricity by 2020. And California's out there with 33%, of course you would expect. And New York, surprisingly, also is in the close to 30% with their target. So they're pretty aggressive as well. You may know or not know that Iowa already has 25% of its electricity from wind. So all of this stuff is doable. And the problems are, here there's some science challenges. You've got to improve the efficiency. So the most efficient solar cell you can buy is about 22%. But you can do in the lab 40%, but it's too expensive. So there's headroom there for science and technology to make things better. And you got to lower the cost. Cost has come down tremendously in the last 5 years. That's one reason for this. So that looks pretty good. Just keep doing it. How about safe, higher performing nuclear electricity? So there's some challenges. There's at least 3 challenges. But let me just talk about the history for a minute. You know, way back in the 1950s, Lewis Strauss, who was on the Atomic Energy Commission, made a famous statement. He's actually talking about fusion, but everybody thinks he was talking about fission. He said, electricity will be so cheap we don't need to meter it. And this is a statement that shows tremendous optimism. And that's kind of the attitude that there was in the 50s and 60s. Wow, look at this nuclear electricity, what's wrong with it? And in those days, of course, no one was thinking climate. So the fact that it produced no CO2 was not part of their thinking. And then a couple of things happened. We had 3 Mile Island, an accident. In the 70s, we had Chernobyl, another accident in Russia. And we had Fukushima a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, I guess, which woke everybody up. And the public began to think this is not such a good idea, it's too dangerous. And so that put a stop by the 80s, that put a stop to expanding nuclear reactors in this country. Some other countries are still doing it. And the interesting thing is that it's really public opinion that determines how nuclear power goes. That's not true of almost any other energy technology. So we know how to make reactors. We've already put them out there. We could put out a lot more of them if we wanted to. It's the public opinion that says, no, I think that's too risky. And if you look around the world, the differing attitudes, reactions to Fukushima, the Swiss and the Germans said, that's it, we're done. When our present set of reactors runs out, gets to the end of their life, we're not doing any more, that's it, we're done. France said, looks like a pretty good idea. They're getting 70% of their electricity from nuclear. Yeah, we'll continue doing it. China's building lots of nuclear plants along with every other kind of power plant. So the reactions are very different. Some of those are governed by public opinion. China probably isn't. But even the public opinion varies. So it's the challenge in my view, and this is, you may take issue with this, but my view is that if we want to do this technology, we have to do something rather compelling that convinces the public that it can be made safe. And it's much more than just someone standing up and saying, trust me, it can be made safe. I don't think that's going to work. So you need some kind of new technology to switch to something else. So I think that's actually the biggest challenge. And I will tell you, I'm not convinced. I've been to plenty of talks where people say, I think it can be made safe, and I'm thinking, yeah, good luck. So I think we need to have something for this. But if you look at the science side, these things were built in the 60s. They're about 35% efficient. There's no reason why we couldn't do the technology much better now and have 50% efficiency. If you're going to do that, you have to run at a higher temperature. To run at a higher temperature, you have to have more neutrons, so more efficient reactions taking place. More neutrons. That means you need materials in the reactors that can stand the higher temperature and the higher neutron flux. And there are such materials. Here's one of them. It's really a material science problem. This happens to be copper and niobium layers, which is remarkably resistant to radiation damage. So there are ways to deal with this problem if the public wants. Then there's the problem of what to do with the nuclear waste. We do not recycle nuclear waste because in the United States and a few other countries, the fear that it could fall into terrorist hands is strong. And one way to prevent that is just don't recycle it. Once the spent fuel is taken out of the reactor, store it. That's what we do now. Usually store it at the reactor site and don't do anything with it. And it turns out it's not a problem to keep doing that for many more decades. There's plenty of room and we could handle it. But there's a lot of energy in that spent fuel, which is not, that one went backwards, wow. Which is not, good. I'm learning. Okay. So there's a lot of energy in the spent fuel that you could recover and use. So that's nuclear electricity. It could be made safe. We have the technology and science to do it if we wish. The next one is there we go. Shale gas. So I was talking about 25-year predictions, which is what most people do. This is a prediction of where we're going to get our natural gas from now, that's here, 2010, it's a little bit old, about 25 years. And this is made by the Energy Information Administration, EIA, in Washington. So it's for the U.S. Very reliable, I mean, one of the most conservative organizations, and everybody takes their word as gold. But understanding that predictions almost invariably have to be wrong, but these are some of the best predictions you can make. So even when you do the 25-year, let's extrapolate from the present prediction, shale gas goes from 23% in 2010 to 50% in 2035. So a huge increase. It's really going to grow. And that's a good thing. Here's what's happened to the price. So go back to 05 to 08, the peak was around $12 in these units. The non-peak was around 8, it was fluctuating. And since January of 2012, it's been around $2 to $4. A huge decrease in price, a huge increase in supply. What could be better? And there are indications that because of shale gas, well, it's not an indication, it will definitely happen, the U.S. will become an exporter of gas, natural gas, instead of an importer, which is what the track was on before. And even perhaps there's also shale oil that's happening in your neighboring state, North Dakota, for example. And because of shale gas and oil, we may become a net exporter of energy. That's a ways off, but that's within range. But the other thing that shale gas has done is made it interesting for manufacturing firms to come back to the United States. So they all went to China because the labor was cheap. Some of them are coming back to the United States because the energy is cheap. And that's especially true of petrochemicals. So plastics and things that you often make from an oil feedstock, you can also make from a natural gas feedstock. It's just hydrocarbons. And you can do it a lot cheaper because the price of gas now per unit of energy or per unit of hydrocarbon is a lot less than the price of oil. So those kinds of companies are coming back. So this is a good thing. On the other hand, it's a bad thing. And it's a bad thing, I didn't mention this map, let me just mention it, that unlike oil, which is concentrated in a few areas around the world. Shale gas seems to be much more equitable. Here's a map that's also a little bit old, a couple of years old by now, of where the shale plays are around the world. And you see they're kind of everywhere. The gray areas don't count. We don't know. Those are unknown areas, so don't write them off. But the areas that have been mapped, there's shale, shale gas plays, lots of places. So this is kind of good from a global perspective as well. But here's the bad, hydraulic fracturing. So fracking, I'm sure you guys all know how it works, but let me take a minute to explain. You drill a vertical well. When you get down to the shale play, which is usually not very deep, so it's narrow, you want to turn 90 degrees. And one of the reasons shale has happened is that we know how to do this technology. So you turn 90 degrees and you drill horizontally to try to stay within the shale play. And if you really want to tap that shale play, you drill not one well, but you turn and go horizontal in this direction, this direction, this direction, this direction. So why not get all 360? So you've got a lot of wells going. And then at the end of this casing, you've previously put some places you can blow holes. You blow the hole and you put high pressure water in here, and it's the water being released into the shale play which fractures it. So hydraulic fracturing. You exceed the yield stress of the rock formation. And then along with the water, of course, is the proppant, sand or something, which goes in and keeps the cracks open so that when you take the water out, the gas flows out aft. A couple of problems with that. It takes a lot of water. Not every place where you have shale do you have enough water, and water gets contaminated pretty seriously when it comes out of the shale play. So what do you do with it? Well, one of the most common things to do, and this is established practice, nothing new, you drill another deep hole somewhere, and you pump the water into that hole and let it stay there. So it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, and out of range, out of harm's way. That can have its own issues. So there's two things. You need a lot of water. You've got to get rid of a lot of toxic water. Third issue, you can release methane in various ways in this process that you don't want to release. So you can release it near the surface, usually out of the well. Oops. Usually you release the methane that comes to the surface somewhere near the surface. So you may have fracked the well casing near the interface with the surface. And that can put it into the water, that can put it into the atmosphere. Down here in the shale play, you really don't know where those cracks are going to go. So you release some high pressure water in there and cracks start, well, you might crack only a little distance away from the well, right? So you may not access the whole shale play. Or you might crack way beyond the edge of the shale play and start releasing natural gas into the usually porous rock formations above it. So it's a pretty uncontrolled process. So the major point I want to make here, let me tell one more story, and that is, how do you fix this? So you could just have tighter regulations. We need them, no doubt. But what does that do? You have to, first of all, figure out what those regulations are, implement them, and have a core of regulators that you pay to enforce them. So it costs you money to put regulations out there. And the regulations are going to restrict, undoubtedly, what the drillers do. That's how you make it safer. So their operation is going to get less profitable. There is another alternative. And that alternative is to understand the fracking process well enough from a science and technology point of view that you can control it. So the regulations you would put would be far less, let's say, intrusive to the process. And in the bargain, you would figure out how to access the entire shale play. So one of the things with present fracking, is that you frack the well, a flow of gas comes out, it's wonderful. It lasts a couple of years and then it tails off, and ultimately you may get about 15 or 20% of the gas that's in the shale out. So if you understood the science and technology of fracking much better, you could get 50% of it out. So there's a double benefit, and you could fix the environmental problems without being so intrusive in a regulatory sense. So this is a wonderful challenge, I feel, for the future. Now, can I make this happen? Yes. So let's go to the next one. We were talking about what to do with those carbon emissions. So everyone now talks about, well, let's capture them, and we'll put them underground in an underground cavern somewhere. So the rocks underground, the ones that are suitable for this, are porous. That's why you can put carbon dioxide into them. But that means that the carbon dioxide can migrate, and it might go miles away from where you inserted it, and it might find a way to pop back up into the atmosphere. And if that were the case, think about this. If the leak rate is 1% from the sequestered carbon, and you wait 100 years, then everything you put in the first year is out. And 100 years is a very short time scale on the scale of climate change. So you've got to keep it sequestered for many hundreds, people say 1,000 years, or maybe even a couple of thousand years, to really have an impact. So that's a tough proposition. Well, there's another option, and that's what I'm advocating here, and that is turn that carbon dioxide into rocks. So here's the chemical reaction. M is some metal oxide. And CO2, it forms this thing, so think of the metal as calcium. Calcium plus carbon dioxide makes calcium carbonate. And the interesting thing is it releases energy in the process. So it's a spontaneous reaction. And here's the energy level diagram. Here's carbon. If you make carbon dioxide out of it, it's pretty stable, right? So this is a big energy change. It's pretty stable. But carbonate rock is even more stable. So that means when you store it as carbonate rock, you more or less don't have to worry about it going anywhere. It's not going to spontaneously react into anything else. So that's a good thing. So permanent, benign storage. What do we do with calcium carbonate? We build buildings out of it. That's limestone, for example. It's pretty harmless. Here's a picture of a person holding carbonate powder. It's not harmful to people. There's no follow-up monitoring. You more or less just look at it every day. There it is. It's sitting out on the surface of the earth, or it's in a building or somewhere. So you don't have to worry about something that's underground. And what about the capacity? This is what I find to be the most amazing thing. Here's a chart. It has the atmosphere, the surface of the ocean, the deep ocean, and carbonate rocks, which and how much they can hold. What's the size of the reservoir? So the atmosphere is about 720 gigatons, and it's already saturated. You know, that's what it's got. Everyone hopes, and this does happen, of course, that the atmosphere exchanges carbon dioxide with the surface ocean, the shallow ocean. That's where it's going. It takes a while for it to get in, but it's about the same reservoir, not very different. It's the deep ocean that has the big reservoir, and that's the down thousands of feet, and that reservoir is huge, 36,000 gigatons, much bigger than the atmosphere of the surface ocean. And very, very slowly, the carbon dioxide that's in the surface ocean gets transferred to the deep ocean. How does it do that? It does that through the so-called thermohaline current, or sometimes called the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt. So a surface current comes along our east coast, gets up to Greenland, gets cold, gets salty, and goes down. And then it comes down along Europe, and it goes lots of places through the deep, goes south in the Atlantic, circles around the Pacific, around Antarctica, and eventually comes back up to the surface. This takes 400 to 1,000 years to happen. One cycle. And that means, and that's what mixes the surface ocean with the deep ocean. And that's why people say, you'll get, if we stop putting out CO2 now, we'll eventually get it all out of the atmosphere, but we have to wait. There's a bottleneck. It's this thermohaline current, and it's going to take thousands of years for that equilibration to happen. But if it does happen, you can take it. Here it is. Here is the reservoir of all the carbonate rocks on Earth. Look at the number. It's 1,000 times bigger than the deep ocean. So, and here, I'm sorry, this is covered up. This is a number like 4,000. If you burned all the fossil fuels, that's what you would produce. So the deep ocean can handle it. The carbonate rocks can handle it even more. In a sense, they wouldn't even notice it. So there are people thinking about this. There are a couple of challenges. The reaction is slow, and that means you'd like to speed it up. So you need a catalyst for this reaction. But we know a lot about catalysts, right? We look for catalysts all the time. So it's not inconceivable that you would be able to find one. And it turns out the surface of the oxide rocks tends to get passive. So the reaction goes slowly because there's a surface coating. So you'd have to control the surface coating. But this is an idea that doesn't get a lot of attention. Some people are thinking about that is a little bit, let's say, out there, a little bit off the charts, but very interesting. I want to talk about electricity. That's the next thing. I said storage, and I'm really going to talk about this tomorrow, so I won't say a whole lot. But here's a little introduction. Go back to 1880, Thomas Edison's day, before electricity really was popular, and ask over the years, the intervening century plus, what's happened. It's been used, this is the percentage, this is not labeled, sorry. U.S. primary energy that goes into electricity, that's what this percentage is. So it was nothing to start with. And it grew because it was so useful. So you can refrigerate with electricity. Of course, you can light with electricity. You can have, in cities at least, you can have electric trains that run around the city on electricity. Here's our friend on his cell phone, and these other things that you've already seen. And this could happen if electric cars take off. We'll put a lot more of our energy. In fact, you can pretty much calculate what it is, how much energy goes into your gas tank. That's the energy that you would now potentially be putting into the electricity grid. So it could get a lot bigger. It's really, really, really useful. And this is another way of, in a cartoon fashion, of looking at how useful it is. Here's all the ways you can make electricity on this side. Here's all the ways you can use electricity on this side. And it all has to go through the power grid. So you know what these are, the typical ways to take heat, turn heat through a heat engine into rotary motion. Turn that rotary motion in, put a generator on that rotary motion, turn that rotary motion into electricity, and then send that electricity through the power grid to all these things. Well, you don't need to get the heat from combustion, right? You could get it from the sun, from solar thermal. So there's a net plus. You don't have to get the mechanical motion from a heat engine. You can get it from wind or hydro. So you can eliminate some more of this side of the diagram. You don't even need mechanical motion from a photovoltaic device. You could get a direct conversion from sunlight to electricity. And you could get it from fuel cells, which actually does require fuel. So there's lots of ways to get it, really diverse. And there's lots of ways to use it. And if you think about this, it's pretty clean. Except for this heat part, the combustion part. So once you get to this point, it's really efficient. Generators and motors are maybe 90% efficient, really efficient, compared to gasoline engines in your car or turbines that produce electricity. They're typically, your car's 25% efficient. A lot of coal plants are maybe 35% efficient. So the efficiency is high for electricity, and it's clean. So once you get the electron, it goes through the power grid at high voltage. It does some work over here, whatever it is, comes back through the other side of the grid at low voltage, and goes back to the generator, basically. And there's no evidence that it was ever there. So it doesn't make any chemical reaction at the point of use, and it's invisible. So it's really, really benign. The one thing we can't do, I'm going to show this tomorrow, so I'll skip through it. I think I'll skip through everything. So let me just make a comment, and I'll leave this up. Just back up. The one thing that's holding up both transportation and the electricity grid is cheap storage. So we can't do it cheaply. If you wanted to drive your car, and especially in the West, nobody drives their car just 20 miles. Very few people do. You drive more every day. The range of the Chevy Bolt is 38 miles on one charge. The range of a Nissan Leaf is 63 miles on one charge. That's just not enough to satisfy most consumers, most drivers. So you need a battery that's not any bigger, not any more expensive, but has 5 times the energy. Why? Because 5 times 30, or 45 times 40 is 200, and 5 times 60 is 300. That's about the range on one tank of an ordinary car. So you got to get into that range. With the grid, we now have to produce electricity at exactly the same rate as we use it. We spent 100+ years figuring out how to balance this equation, how to turn generators on and off really fast to exactly match demand. We're pretty good at it. But that, and the reason we do that is you can't store energy. So you got to use it when you make it. And that's really inefficient. So you end up building a lot of infrastructure that you don't need. So I'll talk more about that tomorrow. And so I'll skip all of this and go to the last big thing, the last big idea. Can you make chemical fuel sustainable? And the simple answer is no, you can't, because you burn gasoline or any hydrocarbon, you get air, and you get water and carbon dioxide, and that's it. You never try to bring it back. Well, since about the year 2000, a little bit later, people have been thinking, well, maybe you can do it. So let's think of how would you do it. 2003, we started to think about hydrogen. So hydrogen is not a hydrocarbon, it's just hydrogen. We're not talking about fossil fuels here. But just hydrogen, let's say you could make it renewably. And you might do that by splitting water. But you would burn the hydrogen, its only combustion product, or if it's not, it could be a fuel cell, it's not really a flame, but its only oxidation product is water. The water goes back harmlessly through the environment and gets reconstituted through some energy source, or the sun or the wind, into hydrogen. This would be fully sustainable. And this is what people were thinking in 2003. We realized after a while that there's some problems here. One of the big problems is this one, how do you make it? So most of the, 90% of the hydrogen in this country is made by reforming methane, CH4. And you do some water reactions and so on. And you get hydrogen out, great. You also get CO2 out of that. And you have to compare converting the methane to hydrogen and then using the hydrogen with just using the methane directly. And when you make that comparison, you realize there's virtually no difference. So you haven't reduced the CO2 emissions, you haven't gotten any more energy, and that, they call it reforming process, actually is. It's not that great an idea, and we don't really think this way anymore. So then along comes another idea. Well, let's use biofuels. So the first one we know about, of course, is corn ethanol. That looked pretty good for a long time. The idea is from crops, you take the corn, you convert it to ethanol, and you burn the ethanol in your car. CO2 comes back through the atmosphere and gets the input to the next cycle of growing corn. So it's neutral, is the first thought, for CO2, and you just keep this process. There's plenty of water around, so you just keep this process going. And what do you rely on? You rely on plants, which use photosynthesis, energy from the sun, to make the corn, which is then processed into ethanol, and it goes back like this. So you're recycling. Here, it's only the hydrogen that gets recycled. Here, it's the hydrogen and the CO2 through a plant. But we began to think about that and realized there are problems with this too. One of the biggest problems is, well, you really need the corn for food. So why don't you, and the answer is, well, why don't you go then to what's called cellulosic biofuels. Take the leaves and the stems and use them to produce the ethanol or whatever biofuel you're going to use. And that can work. And there's a lot of work going on starting in about 2007 to make this happen. It's really expensive. So if you do that with the things we know now, it's about twice the cost of corn ethanol. And that turns out, well, it's on the verge of being not economic. So that's one problem. So there's some science and technology that has to be done. And the second problem that is, it takes land. So the best estimates are, if you take all the land that's not being used for food and you plant biofuel crops on it, you might be able to replace about 30% of transportation fuels. And that, I think everybody would say, that's optimistic, but that's what you might be able to replace. So you might solve 30% of the problem, but 70% of the problem is still going to do it. So this is not something that you want to throw away. You want to do this, because who knows, it might suddenly break through fracking that would make it much more appealing than it seems to be now. So this is going on. But now here's the opportunity, let's say the horizon for the future. Do this, but reconstitute, get rid of the plant. So do it artificially, again, with solar or wind power, right? It has to be renewable. Don't use a plant, use some combination of chemicals in the laboratory to reproduce this process. And in principle, you would recycle the carbon dioxide and the water, and you could have one set of fuels that you just keep using over and over and over. Optimistic view, but in principle that can happen. So can you do that? Well, the next graph here shows, you're not supposed to actually read this, all the ways that people have thought, the candidate ways to reconstitute carbon dioxide and water to fuel. And the point of this graph is there's lots. So there's plenty of room to explore. And although we're not there yet, this is a place where science and technology could make a big impact over the longer term. So I have 3 slides, or maybe it's only 2, that I want to wrap up with. So those are the things that I would put R&D into for the next 50 years to achieve the global society that you can imagine you would want. That's the major part of the talk. There's a little addendum here. What does it cost to do things? And these squares indicate what it costs to discover a new material or a new phenomenon. Turns out, without looking at these, let's say that's $1. Just give it a number, it's $1. Then if you want to develop something from that material or that phenomenon and show that you might be able to turn it into a technology, that typically takes $10. And if you want to actually, if this looks good, you want to deploy it on a large scale, that takes typically $100. So who has this kind of money? Well, the government does. That's why we have DOE and SF, NIH, and so on. The cost of discovery is something a government could pay for. The cost of development is not something the government is us, that's our tax. So, but the cost of development is something that a government can help with, but really can't finance. That has to be commercially done. And certainly the cost of deployment, the government should stay out of. And they can encourage, but they really can't do it. That somebody has to make a big bet, some company, that if I bring this cell phone out, it's going to sell. And I'll be able to make back all the money that I put into deploying it. And that cycle for cell phones seems to work pretty good. We want it. So we consumers shell out cash, and here comes the next generation of cell phones. So there it goes. And that's an example of a technology that I think we would all like to have. Nobody would say, I don't want my cell phone. We all do want it. It's really useful. That's why we pay for them. And there's an example of discovery and innovation making society better. So that's a really positive thing. But there are some things that, societal problems, what do you do with carbon dioxide? It's not clear that there's a business solution. And we're back here, we need some discoveries, we need some new ideas, and somebody has to do some development to see if they're really going to work. And it's a question of how would you deploy that? And that's a place where maybe government has to work. Economics and policy has to come into play. So the message I want to leave is that we should always be supporting discovery studies. Why? The cost is low relative to everything else. It stimulates innovation, and innovation is the lifeblood of all those other things you saw in the last few graphs. but it is also those things that make society better. So we need that. Remarkably, it tells you what will fail before you attempt to develop it. So if you understand your discovery well enough, you can say, might be a good idea, but let me think about it a little bit more. No, it's not going to work. That's a great one. It takes back more than it costs. So economists will tell you that half of the GDP growth since World War II due to innovations, discoveries. That's a pretty good record. You know, if I were an investor, I'd go for that. And it primes the innovation ecosystem. So I think that my personal view, sort of the conclusion of this talk, is that we ought to be supporting discovery science with government money and private money, even when times are bad. So here's my perspective. Energy determines the aspirations and the limitations of society, so it's really important. It's a little bit like money. You want a vibrant, interactive, inclusive, and rapidly advancing global society in 50 years, my vision, you may argue. If you want that, here are the 3 energy outcomes you have to achieve. Security, which means adequate, affordable, sustainable, and predictable, stable climate, and at least a measure of economic growth, always. And here are the things we just talked about that could be. So I'm going to stop there. I'd love to have some discussion. I hope I provoked you to think a little bit out of the box. And thank you. Yes.
Quick question on your $3 sign slide. Could you add time between each phase?
Oh, wow. Oh, interesting. Sure. So last 20 years, a lot of studies have come out that say from here, discovery, to here is about a 20-year time scale in the best case. And I'm trying to think of the examples that prove that, and they don't come to mind. One that does come to mind that was actually only 10 years was the discovery in '86, it eventually won the Nobel Prize, that giant magnetoresistance. So by manipulating a magnetic field in this direction, I can turn on or off an electric current in this direction. And that turned out to be a breakthrough for memory, computer memory, and computer logic. So for a while, that took, it was discovered about '86, I think it was, maybe '87. And 10 years later, it was already in hard disks. That's a record. Most times are much longer. So so we talk about, let's get the cost down. And I think it's equally important to talk about, let's get the time down. So the time, I'll tell you tomorrow, but it's a good story right now. Lithium-ion batteries, the best battery technology we've ever had. Thought of in 1971, pretty much in the UK and the US. The ideas were there. We said, that'll never work. It's stupid, but as it turned out, it did. Commercialized in 1991, so there's an example of the 20-year time lapse, by Sony in Japan, because they knew they needed something for all the personal electronics that they were building, and it was the lithium-ion battery. That went through the normal process of very slow in the community. I discover something, maybe it's rather small, but it might be important, so I publish it. It takes me a year to write up the paper and get it published through the peer review process and appear in a journal. Somebody reads it. Is that interesting? I don't know. Maybe after 6 months, people say, well, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Maybe I'll work on that. It's this time cycle that is this problem. So why don't you figure out a way to shorten that time scale, that process? And that's what I'll tell you tomorrow. It's actually JCESR with battery R&D. We think we can shorten it dramatically. I don't see why you couldn't shorten it by a factor of 2 at least, maybe a factor of 3. So thanks for that question, and there's one answer to it. Yeah.
In your ideal society 50 years from now, is that in population growth?
Wow. We'd like it to go down.
Isn't that going to counter to,
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So people say in 50 years we might have 10 billion people. But I think it's a really good, deep question, and that this touches on it touches on science, it touches on technology, policy, economics. It probably just shouldn't be. And if you could imagine that some of them wouldn't be born, well, that's an imposition on some families who want to have children, so there are lots of issues there. But if they weren't born, resources would go a lot farther and life might be better for everybody who is born. So how do you deal with that? I don't know. It's really, China said only one child. They've started to relax that policy now, and they're seeing that they got a lot of old people. Their population is aging as a result. You can ask, is that a good or a bad thing? I don't know, but it's different. So I don't want to go anywhere near that, and I actually don't have any intelligent things to say about it. But I think that is just as important as energy and everything else is. So great comment.
So when you said about the goal of involving 40% of women, is that 40% of primary energy or of electricity?
Of electricity.
So it's a much smaller fraction.
Yes.
It's not really affecting things like this.
Absolutely.
Now we have a number of people in this room who are in fact experts on fracking.
Yeah, good. I had the sense there probably were.
And so one of the things I'd like to hear is some of their comments on what you said about the fracking and what they see as the R&D challenges to.
I would love to hear that too. What expert would like to?
I've got an expert right here.
I was, the thing I would jump in and say, I don't know if I have my news right, but the discovery of deployment of things like fractions,
Yeah, that's a 5-year plan.
That was an incredible. So, I mean, even just the horizontal outflow technology has come so far so fast. That's been a big game changer. And so, there's ways to circumvent that process.
So I think it's a great example of a counterexample that you can go faster. And that means we should probably try to do that, in the first place.
Any other comments on the fracking part?
Well, I'll jump in. Stu mentioned that the short development time from our experience with the Bakken Formation specifically, where it went from an unproducible rock to a reservoir that's bigger than Saudi Arabia in a short period of time. But it was really a culmination of a number of activities that had to come together. And that's one of the things that I think these isolated development parts, in many cases, require other elements in order to get this, or the discovery parts, in order to get into the development phase. And that's one of the issues that I can see. Clearly, your battery research is important for minimizing our use of hydrocarbons as a primary transportation fuel. But there's other issues involved, and it's primarily the storage of electricity that you got to. It's not just the batteries in the car. You got to figure out a way to ramp up the power. So anyway, that's a interesting problem.
Great point.
Do you guys at MSU have any questions you'd like to ask? I mean, we're sort of here right in front of him, but you're back there in the picture.
Oh, there they are. Okay.
Right there. But they're also back there. So anyway.
There's one. There's two.
Yeah, there's two. So ask
You know how to do it.
I don't know how to do it. You're in the
So, could you? I think I got it. But could you just repeat that? Okay. So two aspects to that at least. One is, can you just make them just strictly technological? I don't know why I'm looking at the image of you, but I
Look out this way, the camera, right?
The two aspects. So just the technological one. Can you make the reactor more efficient? Can you run it at higher temperature and higher neutron flux? And my feeling is the answer is yes. There was one material that I showed, copper niobium layer, which really looks promising. It's not the only one. And there's research in that area and discoveries, but not a lot of excitement because nobody thinks it's going to go anywhere. The other one is, can you do something, find a new material that would be convincing to the public that it can be made safe? And I think that's a tougher one. So you hear a lot about small modular reactors. And the more I read about it, the more excited I get about it, but I'm not close enough to make any judgments. The claim is they're designed to be passively safe, so you can walk away from it, turn off all the cooling pumps, complete loss of electrical power, and the thing will remain safe. It won't go critical, it won't release anything, and so on. And if A, is it true? And B, can it be tested in such a way that the public buys it? And I believe because of the way public opinion is, and because it's so strongly, some of it is so strongly anti-nuclear at the moment, it would need some number of years, or a decade, of proven use for people to say, well, yeah, maybe it is okay. And that's one that I'm not as close to. But I have the feeling that if you made it your top priority to find the materials to make reactors passively safe, that it could be done. I guess I'm basically an optimist. I'm not saying that that would be convincing and that would change the game, but I think from just a materials point of view, you could.
They're effective too, by the way.
Oh, okay.
So
good. Yeah.
someone else has a question.
Yeah, okay. I mentioned 2 cars, but there's
You need
3.
to face the camera, George.
Yeah, sorry. I mentioned 2 cars, but there's 3. I don't know where the camera is.
Look at that back there.
Okay. So I mentioned 2 cars, but there's really 3. And there is the Tesla. And Tesla has solved the problem. Because you can buy a Tesla that will go 260 miles on a single charge. That's pretty good. There is a downside to it. What they did is to just put more of today's batteries under the, I don't know if it's the hood, but into the car. They packed them into the car somewhere. And it costs $100,000. So I would say that's probably not a mass market car. And although there are people in Chicago who own Teslas, and I actually, none of them are my friends, unfortunately, but I know them.
My sister has 2.
More power to her, so to speak. But everybody loves them, and
California, they have a sedan and they have one of the roosters in the sport.
I bet she loves it.
I think it's a
Okay. But everybody I know that has one really loves it, and I see why. It's a wonderful, it's a fun car to drive, and you can buy it because you're, eco-friendly and so on. But I think a lot of people buy them just because it's a lot of fun to drive them. And I was a passenger in a Tesla. I was never a driver, but I can see that it's a lot of fun. But to get back to Tesla, a couple of things. Look at the one hand at Detroit, and look at the other on the other hand at Tesla. You cannot think of 2 more different ways of doing business. They're willing to take a risk. It's willing to make an innovation. For a long time, everyone said, Tesla, forget about it. Now everyone's saying, Tesla, I got to buy the stock. So there's a big turnaround there. And that's kind of the thing that we need more of. We need more innovators, and there will always be losers as well as winners. Tesla happens to be, at the moment, a big winner. But it's really not a mass market solution. So I believe, and I'll say a little bit more about this tomorrow, that you need a battery that has 5 times the capacity, so it can go 5 times as far without increasing the cost at all, or even decreasing the cost, in order to reach that tipping point where there's lots of electric cars. So I'll tell you a personal story. I drive 25 miles one way when I go to Argonne. And I got to come back. That's 50. And I thought about a Nissan Leaf at 60 or so miles range, and I thought that's just too risky. I'm not going to do it. If it was 150 at the same price, I might have. Who knows? I might have done it. But it was really the range that bothered me. So I don't think we're there yet.
So if a car takes 250 watt hours to drive a mile like a Chevy Volt, and you drive it 100, 300, 400 miles, and your house has only got a 100 amp service, how long is it going to take to charge it up versus how long it takes me to stick the nozzle in the gas pump? And
Great question. So most the Leaf and the Volt take about 10 hours. And if you take the range of the Volt and divide the 10 hours by how far you can go, you got to charge about 16 minutes to go a mile. Now, if you're a fast walker, you can walk a mile in 16 minutes, which means it's faster to walk to your destination than it is to charge your car up to drive. And that's a real problem, actually. That's personal opinion. And you hit it right on the head. The charging time is just too long. So you not only need a higher capacity battery, you need one that you can charge with.
you'll never do a road trip with an electric car.
Right. Tesla claims that
No cannonball run.
well, they claim they're going to put enough charging stations along some highway, high speed, high rate charging. You can do that. I haven't seen it yet, and that's a good one. So maybe it's an around town car. No, it's not a lot. I don't know. There are lots of solutions. You can also think, I'll drive in and I will get a recharge in 3 minutes. I'll do it by taking the battery out and putting the freshly charged one in. And Tesla has a video where he was challenged to do it in 5 minutes. He did 2 recharges, 2 battery swaps in 5 minutes. So there's another idea, right? So good point.
Your other issue is my older Toyota Corolla is older than maybe half the people in this room, and the engine still runs. A lithium-ion battery will not last 3 or 5 years, and you got to get a new one, and that's a lot of dollars per pound.
And that's a really good point. And now that you've paid off the car, it's got to be your cheapest one. Anything that you use now, margin. Yeah, good point. Yes. Oh, who's first?
I go with Dennis.
Okay, yes. So, great question, and a lot of thinking about how long oil will last. And if you look at BP, for example, I know so does BP, and that's their business, of course, oil. And the usual thing is to look at reserves, divide by rate of use, and say 40 years. We got 40 years of oil. The thing is, for the last, I don't know, at least 60 or 70 years, we've always had 40 years of oil. And the reason is that as soon as you start to run out or get close to that 40-year limit, let's go out and find some more. So one of the things that's happening right now, everyone knows, the Arctic is warming up. And that exposes now a lot more deep sea possibilities for drilling. And no one knows for sure, but there's a good guess that there's a lot of undersea oil in the Arctic that with time, and maybe not such a long time, will become producible. So 5 years ago, I was mired in this, peak oil and things like that. And the experience that since those 5 years I've kind of watched, it hasn't changed much. So nobody can predict the future, but my feeling is there's way more oil than 40 years. And natural gas, shale gas, who knows? So I really don't think the problem with sustainability is that we'll run out of it. It's that we'll eventually come to the conclusion, and there's a spectrum of opinion probably in this room too, about how serious that is, but the climate will stop it first, is my opinion.
I would agree, and some of the technologies that you mentioned, I mean, reserves divided by usage, reserves isn't a constant. Like, reserves is a function of the technology we have to get them out of the ground. It's not just the oil that exists. It's, only the oil exists that we're currently able to produce at a given time. So the number we had prior to, say, the Bakken and, some of these other shale plays coming in is a much smaller reserves number. So as usage goes up, if we can keep reserves growing, then like you said, it's not going to be an issue of running out of oil. It's an issue of needing to switch it. So what's your line? Yes.
You both have the last question.
Sure.
I was just curious about the mineralization of CO2. Given how much CO2 is produced just by like a single power plant in a year, the inputs as far as metals go and the outputs as far as metal oxides seems, somewhat impractical in my opinion. But I was wondering how that would.
No, and I didn't say a word about capacity.
Yeah.
In that sense, you need a lot of metal oxide
Yeah.
to go with all the CO2 that's being produced, that's for sure. In fact, you probably have to mine it. So you go somewhere, silicate is one of the things that works, is happened to be on that slide a little farther down. You'd have to mine this stuff, and you would need a big processing plant where you can control the surfaces of the reacting surfaces so they don't passivate. No, it would be an active process. And then you would produce an awful lot of carbonate rock that you'd have to put somewhere. So one of the ideas is you mine out the oxide ore, the metal oxide ore, you turn it into carbonate rock, and you put it back where you got it from.
Okay.
And it's really big. But you could imagine doing that. And it depends on how badly do you want to burn that fossil fuel, or how badly do you need to burn that fossil fuel. But great question. I think this is so early stage. There's no real answer to it, but that's one of the things people think about.
Joe actually took the words right out of my mouth. That's the exact question I was going to ask, but I have lots, so that's okay. So I guess another question that I would ask is, I remember hearing recently about the use of carbon capacitors as a method of energy storage. I was wondering what your opinions would be on that, whether it's a viable technology in the near future, and that would solve a lot of the issues with electric cars as far as storage capacity and charging rates and all those different things. What are your opinions on that technology?
So it's a really good technology, and there's a lot of science there. It turns out one thing I remember, which is by now a few years old, that I think is still quite relevant. If you make the pore size in a carbon surface smaller and smaller and smaller, the capacity to store charge goes up way faster than you would have expected. And for a long time, nobody could really understand that. And the feeling now is it has to do with that surface is next usually to a liquid. And the charges are dissolved as ions in the liquid, and they have around them a solvation shell. And what happens if the pore is big, the whole solvation shell gets stored. If the pore is small, it jettisons the solvation shell, and just the ion gets stored, and therefore there's room for a lot more. So that's a great breakthrough, and that's something, that's like a discovery that we ought to be making use of. Where could it go? It has to get a little bit cheaper, just like batteries, it has to get a little bit cheaper. The capacitors have the great advantage that they are quick. So they can store and release energy in microseconds, whereas a battery can take a much longer time. And on the other side, their capacity isn't huge. So a lithium-ion battery is better for storing a lot of energy, not so good for getting it in and out fast. So maybe you think of this hybrid combination, you've got a battery and you've got an electrocapacitor, and wow, when you put your foot down on the battery and you want to pass a car going uphill, in kicks the capacitor, and wow. So there's lots of opportunities there. So I'm actually a fan of it. I think it's a good idea.
This is a great set of questions, and I'm sure what we want to do is remind everybody, you want to learn more about energy storage, you should come to this place tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, okay? And I think we need to thank George again, but he will be up here for a little while. People have individual questions to ask him. Please come up and mingle with him. So thanks a lot. questions.
Yeah, questions.
So he's going to be available, I think, in that room at 8 o'clock in the morning, also at MSU.
So this works pretty good.
Yeah. Okay.